People couldn't hold back their laughter as an old rusty pickup truck rumbled onto the tarmac. From the dusty truck emerged Ethan Porter, a mechanic whose hands were stained with grease, wearing a faded flannel shirt and worn-out boots. He was called to fix a billionaire's private jet, a job no one expected him to handle. The high-powered executives, suited and polished, watched from behind glass with mocking smiles, whispering to each other. Their snickers echoed in the air, a clear sign they didn't take him seriously. But Ethan wasn't fazed. He had worked in barns under scorching sun and in the mud, fixing machines others had given up on. To him, it was just another day. As he approached the sleek, silver jet, he heard the soft whispers grow louder, but he wasn't there to impress anyone. His focus shifted to the jet's engine, the hum of the engines mixing with the soft crunch of his boots on the tarmac. He opened the panel and his heart skipped a beat. What he saw made his blood run cold. A fuel leak, dangerously close to the ignition coil. One spark, and the jet could explode midair. He had no time to waste. His fingers flew over the engine, his hands steady despite the mocking stares. There was no room for failure. Only the sound of his tools working and the steady beat of his heart filled the air. Ethan Porter stood tall, his work-worn boots echoing against the cold, hard tarmac of Clearwater International Airport. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the runway. It was still early, the sky bruised with the remnants of dawn, and the wind bit through his thin flannel shirt. His calloused hands were caked with grease, fingers trembling slightly as he tightened his grip around the metal of his toolbox. The sound of the airport hum was far away, a distant drone compared to the pounding of his heart. He had received the emergency call just before the first light of morning. A billionaire's private jet, a mechanical failure. Urgent, no details, no context, just an address and a promise of quick pay. And now here he was, a mechanic, standing alone against the backdrop of the glittering world of the rich and powerful. He was far from the polished executives who watched from behind glass, their eyes mocking, their whispers drifting on the wind like smoke. As Ethan walked closer to the jet, a sleek silver beast glinting in the early light, the whispers turned into laughter. He could feel their eyes on him, their judgment seeping through the air. They leaned against the terminal windows, some shaking their heads, others openly laughing. One of them leaned toward his colleague, whispering something that made both of them chuckle, clearly amused by the man in front of them. But Ethan paid them no mind. He had heard it all before, the dismissive laughter, the judgmental stares. What mattered to him was the jet. That's why he was here after all. Lives were at stake. The jet's engines were still, quiet in their slumber. The hum of the turbines, usually a constant in the air, was absent. Ethan knew that something was wrong, something serious. He set down his tools beside the jet and opened the engine panel. As his hands touched the cold metal, a shiver ran down his spine. He had seen countless machines in worse shape, but this was something different. The fuel line was cracked. Not just cracked, it was melted. The insulation was gone, corroded to the point of no return. And the clamp? It was barely holding on, like a string about to snap. But the worst part? A fuel leak was dangerously close to the ignition coil. One spark, and the jet would explode in midair. Ethan's breath hitched, his mind racing. He had minutes, not hours. He was alone, with no backup, no assistant to help him. But he couldn't walk away, not when he saw what was at stake. Without hesitation, he rolled up his sleeves, his mind focused. His fingers moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime working on machines, fixing engines, welding broken parts, and breathing life into what others had written off. The executives watched him from a distance, their expressions a mix of amusement and disbelief, some even taking out their phones to record. He could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't let it distract him. The only thing that mattered was fixing this jet. If he didn't, the consequences could be catastrophic. Inside the terminal, Delaney Carter, the jet's owner, watched the scene unfold. She had been in the business for years, raised in the world of aviation, surrounded by the best of the best. She had seen pilots, engineers, and mechanics, all vying for her attention, all trying to prove their worth. But none of them had ever caught her attention the way this man did. Delaney wasn't used to seeing people like Ethan. He wasn't polished or refined. He didn't wear designer suits or flaunt a flashy lifestyle. Instead, he stood there in his worn-out jeans and grease-streaked shirt with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. There was something about him, something raw and unpretentious, that made her pause. As she watched him work, her curiosity grew. She had flown jets for years, managed her own fleet, and overseen countless repairs. But what she saw now was different. The man didn't just fix things, he understood them. While the trained pilots had missed the melted fuel line, he had spotted it instantly, like a surgeon identifying a life-threatening wound. Suddenly, the hum of the jet's engines stirred, a low, steady pulse, like the first signs of life after a long sleep. The lights on the plane flickered to life. The engine that had been dormant for so long roared back into action. Delaney's breath caught in her throat. It was alive again. The executives inside the terminal stopped laughing. The smug smiles faded, replaced with stunned silence. One of them whispered, "That should have taken hours." But Ethan didn't celebrate. He didn't even look up. He closed the engine panel and wiped his hands on an old rag, slinging his toolbox over his shoulder. Then the jet's door opened. The steps descended slowly, each click echoing across the quiet tarmac. And Delaney Carter, in her tailored navy suit, with gold buttons gleaming in the early morning light, stepped out. She walked toward Ethan, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Every step was measured, confident. The executives behind her shifted uncomfortably as she passed, and Delaney didn't spare them a glance. When she reached Ethan, she stopped. There was a pause, a moment that stretched for eternity. The wind whispered between them. Then she spoke, her voice steady and quiet. "You fixed it." Ethan blinked, his gaze meeting hers. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. And in that moment, Delaney knew that this man, the mechanic who had been dismissed as nothing more than a simple worker, was the only one who had truly seen the problem. And for the first time, she realized, sometimes it wasn't the most polished, the most refined, or the most powerful who made the difference. Sometimes it was the ones who showed up when others wouldn't, the ones who did the work without the fanfare, the ones who saved lives without asking for anything in return. This moment would change everything. The air was thick with tension as Ethan Porter finished the last of the critical repairs on the private jet. His fingers, stained with grease, were steady despite the mocking laughter of the executives inside the terminal. Their eyes fixed on him with thinly veiled disdain. For all their polished suits and designer ties, they had missed what mattered. Ethan had seen what needed to be fixed, and he'd done it. The jet was alive again. He closed the engine panel, wiped his hands on a rag, and slung his tool bag over his shoulder. The sound of his boots clicking against the tarmac was the only thing that broke the silence. Inside the terminal, Delaney Carter stood at the glass, her eyes never leaving Ethan. For someone so accustomed to being in control, her world had just been tilted on its axis. She had built an empire from the ground up, led her company through turbulent skies, and managed the most complex of aviation problems. But what she had seen outside was something she hadn't expected. A mechanic, in his worn-out jeans and grease-streaked shirt, had saved her jet in a matter of minutes. Delaney had been surrounded by the best in the industry, people who spoke the right language, wore the right clothes, and had the resumes to back it up. But Ethan wasn't one of them. He didn't have the polished confidence or the corporate charm. He had something else, something more real. His focus had never wavered. While everyone else had laughed, he had worked. The sound of his tools moving in the engine had been the only symphony that mattered to him. And now, as Delaney watched him from behind the glass, she felt something shift inside her. Without a word, she turned to her staff, her movements sharp and decisive. "Everyone inside. Now." She didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked toward the door. The executives hesitated but followed, some murmuring under their breath, unsure of what was happening. They couldn't understand it. They were accustomed to the business world where success was measured by wealth and influence. They hadn't seen the kind of quiet expertise Ethan possessed. Delaney stepped onto the tarmac, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, each step echoing like a beat of anticipation. The sound was loud in the otherwise quiet space. Ethan paused mid-step when he saw her approach. There was no fanfare, no dramatic pause. He simply turned toward her, his expression calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment. When she reached him, she stopped. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Delaney looked at Ethan, her eyes narrowing, not in judgment, but in realization. "You fixed it," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice low but steady. "I don't understand," Delaney admitted, her voice a mix of disbelief and awe. "My pilot told me the engine was compromised beyond repair. He said we would have to ground it for a week. He missed the melted fuel line. It was almost touching the ignition coil. He completely missed it." Her words trailed off as she processed what she had just learned. Ethan's gaze softened. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because someone had to." His words were simple, but they carried weight. There was no pretense, no ulterior motive. It was just a statement of fact. Delaney studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something. Maybe an answer, maybe an explanation for why she felt so drawn to him despite everything. She had spent her entire life surrounded by men who spoke the language of power, wealth, and status. But Ethan wasn't interested in any of that. He was here because he was good at what he did. He didn't need to be impressive. He just needed to fix things. A small smile played at the corners of Delaney's lips. Not the forced smile she often wore in boardrooms, but something real, something unguarded. "You could have walked away," she said, her voice quiet, "but you didn't, and I respect that." Ethan blinked, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "I don't walk away from problems, ma'am," he replied. Then Delaney's expression shifted. She took a slow, measured breath, as though she were making a decision that could change everything. She wasn't used to feeling uncertain, but standing here, in front of this mechanic, she felt something she hadn't in years, a desire for something more, something real. She took a step forward, closing the space between them. "What would you do?" she began, her voice low and steady. "If someone like me asked you something completely insane?" Her words hung in the air, thick with the weight of her unspoken question. Ethan didn't flinch. He stood there, his hands still stained with grease, his expression unreadable. "That depend," he said, his voice calm. "What's the question?" Delaney's gaze never wavered as she stood in front of him. Her next words caught both of them off guard. "What if I asked you to marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was no laughter, no judgment, just silence. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes locked onto hers. He didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He simply studied her, as though trying to understand the depth of what she was asking. Delaney, for the first time in her life, wasn't acting out of obligation or expectation. She wasn't performing. She was asking for something real. She was tired of pretending. Ethan wiped his hands on his shirt, his eyes still locked with hers. "You don't even know me," he said, his voice low. "That's why I'm asking," she replied softly. "Because I want to. For the first time, I want something real." Ethan Porter stood in the middle of the tarmac, the distant hum of the jet's engines now steady and strong, but he felt a deep stillness inside. His hands were covered in grease, his clothes stained, and his boots cracked from years of hard work. But the weight of the moment had nothing to do with his appearance. He had fixed the billionaire's jet. He had saved it from disaster, and in doing so, had earned something that no one could take away, his pride. But just as he turned to walk away, ready to leave behind the noise of the mocking executives and the growing tension that had surrounded him, a new sound reached his ears, the soft click of heels against the runway. He paused, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He had only heard one set of footsteps like that before. Strong, confident, but calculated. He didn't need to look to know that Delaney Carter was approaching. He didn't know what to expect from her, but he knew she was different. There was something in the way she carried herself, a sharpness in her gaze that cut through the mask of wealth and power she wore. When she spoke, it was like she wasn't just speaking to him. She was speaking to something deeper, something unspoken between them. Delaney reached him, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. The executives had fallen silent behind the glass of the terminal, watching, waiting. But it was just the two of them now, standing alone in the cold morning air. She stopped in front of him, a fraction of an inch away, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The wind stirred her hair, but she didn't flinch. "You fixed it," she said, her voice soft but strong. Ethan met her gaze. His heart had been racing when he realized the severity of the jet's damage. But now, with Delaney in front of him, something else filled the space between them. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, his voice steady. "I did." Delaney's lips parted slightly, her gaze softening. It was the first time he had seen her so vulnerable, a hint of something real behind the steel exterior. She wasn't the powerful CEO now. She was just a woman standing in front of him, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had suddenly opened between them. "My pilot told me the engine was compromised beyond repair," Delaney continued, her eyes still locked on his. "He said it would take a week to fix. But you saw it. You saw the melted fuel line. He missed it. Completely." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes never leaving hers. Sometimes the simplest things get overlooked. It was right there, and he missed it. But I didn't. He gave a slight shrug, as though it was nothing. He didn't want to boast. He didn't need to explain why he had done it. He had fixed the problem, and that was enough for him. Delaney exhaled, a slow breath that carried a weight of its own. She had lived her life surrounded by people who had never missed anything. They had never failed, never been caught off guard. And yet, here was this mechanic, someone she had written off at first glance, someone she hadn't even wanted to give a chance, standing in front of her with his hands still stained from the very work that had saved her jet. "You didn't do it for me," she said, her voice quiet but full of something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. "You did it because you had to." Ethan's expression didn't change. "That's right." He looked at her now, really looked at her, as if seeing the woman beyond the business mogul. "I didn't ask for a thank you. I just did what needed to be done." Delaney nodded, her lips curling into a small, genuine smile. "I respect that," she said, her eyes searching his for something more. They stood in silence for a beat, the wind picking up again, stirring the air around them. Then, as if something shifted inside her, Delaney took a step closer, her eyes steady but soft. "Ethan," she began, her voice a little less guarded, "what would you do if someone like me asked you something insane?" Ethan's heart skipped, but he didn't let it show. His gaze never wavered from hers. "Depends on the question," he answered, his voice low but calm. Delaney took a breath, her eyes filled with something unspoken. She stepped even closer to him, until there was no space left between them, just the sound of their breath mixing in the cool morning air. "What if I asked you to marry me?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge, bold and unexpected. Ethan blinked, his mind racing as he processed what she was asking. Marry her? Was this a joke? A test of some kind? But when he looked into her eyes, he saw that it wasn't. There was no sarcasm, no hidden agenda. She wasn't asking him for a status symbol. She wasn't asking him for wealth or status. She was asking him for something real. He let the silence stretch between them. "You don't even know me," he said, his voice soft but firm. "That's why I'm asking," Delaney replied, her voice catching slightly. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who only want what I have. But you're different. You didn't try to impress me. You just did what needed to be done." Ethan stared at her, not knowing what to say. This wasn't a decision to make lightly, but in her eyes he saw something he hadn't expected, something genuine. And for the first time he realized he wasn't just another mechanic. To her, he was something more. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Delaney smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, finally free of the mask she had worn for so long. "Because you're the only one who didn't see me as a title. You saw me as a person." The wind had shifted, sweeping across the tarmac in a soft breeze that sent a chill through the air. Ethan Porter stood there, his heart racing, not from the physical exhaustion of the job he'd just completed, but from the sudden, intense shift in his world. He had done it. He had saved the billionaire's private jet. But in doing so, he had unknowingly stepped into a different world, a world where nothing seemed certain anymore. And now, standing in front of him, was Delaney Carter, the woman who had started to challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. The jet behind them hummed quietly, its engines purring like a satisfied beast. But for Ethan, the noise was drowned out by the deafening silence that now hung between him and Delaney. The weight of her words, her unexpected proposal, had left him momentarily speechless. Marry her? He barely knew her. Yet there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't ignore, that told him this wasn't a joke. For years he had been content to work in the shadows, fixing things that others had given up on, doing the hard, dirty work without the need for applause or recognition. He had never been one to seek the spotlight. But now, standing on the tarmac with Delaney, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was being seen. Really seen. Not as a mechanic, not as a worker, but as a person. And the person standing in front of him was asking him for something he couldn't quite fathom. Delaney's eyes softened as she waited for him to speak. She wasn't used to vulnerability. She wasn't used to people saying no to her. But there was something about Ethan, something real, that made her question everything she had ever known about herself. She had spent her life climbing to the top, building an empire, only to find that the more she had, the emptier she felt. And now here was a man, a mechanic with grease on his hands and dirt on his boots, who had given her something that no one else had ever given her: honesty. "I know this is crazy," she said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying uncertainty. "But I can't help it. Something about you, about how you fixed my jet, how you didn't even flinch when everyone laughed at you. It's different. I'm tired of living a life where I'm always performing, always acting a part. I want something real." Ethan listened, his heart beginning to understand the gravity of her words. He had spent his life fixing things that were broken: engines, machines, even relationships. But Delaney was asking for something more, something deeper. And as much as he wanted to walk away, to pretend that this moment wasn't happening, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. "You don't need to explain yourself," he finally said, his voice low but sincere. "I get it, but I don't know what you see in me. I'm just a mechanic. I fix things. I don't belong in your world." Delaney stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart race. "That's just it, Ethan," she whispered. "I'm tired of my world. I've spent so much time building this empire, this legacy, but it's all hollow. It's all just a show. I want something real. I want someone who will see me for who I really am, not the CEO of Carter Sky Tech, and I want you." The words hung in the air between them, the weight of them sinking in as Ethan processed what she was saying. He had never imagined that someone like Delaney Carter, a woman who had everything, would want someone like him. He was just a man who fixed things. He wasn't rich, he didn't have a company, he didn't even own a car that could turn heads. But somehow Delaney had seen something in him that made her willing to risk everything. A small, uncertain smile crossed his face. "I don't know if I can give you what you want," he said softly. "I'm not the kind of man you're used to." Delaney reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. The touch was soft, tentative, but it sent a jolt through Ethan's chest. "You don't need to be anything else," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to change. I'm asking you to be yourself. That's all I want." For the first time in his life, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had always been afraid of not measuring up, of not being enough. But standing here with Delaney, he realized that he didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be real. "All right," he said, his voice steady now, with a hint of something more. "I'll give you that. I'll be real with you. But I can't promise anything else." Delaney's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while she felt at peace. She had asked him for something that could change everything, but now she didn't feel uncertain. She felt free. For once, she wasn't trying to fit into a mold or live up to expectations. She was just being herself, and that was enough. "I'm not asking for promises," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm asking for you to take a chance, and I'm asking you to take it with me." Ethan looked at her, his heart beating in time with the pulse of the jet behind them. "Then let's take it together," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength. And with that, Delaney smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. She had finally found something real, something worth fighting for, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she had made the right choice. As Ethan Porter and Delaney Carter stood together on the tarmac, the weight of their conversation lingered in the air. Delaney had taken a leap, asking Ethan to marry her despite the worlds they came from, one of wealth and power, the other of grit and humility. And now, standing side by side, they both knew that this moment, this connection, could change everything. "I never imagined I'd be here," Ethan said quietly, his voice low but sincere, "with you in this moment. I've spent my whole life fixing things, not really living. But you—" His gaze softened and he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You've made me see that I've been missing out on something." Delaney's heart swelled at his words, her own fears and uncertainties melting away. She had asked for something real, something she couldn't find in the boardrooms or luxury jet lounges. And here it was, standing in front of her. Ethan wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't, and for the first time in her life, neither was she. "I've always been chasing something," Delaney whispered, "but I think I found it, right here with you." And just like that, they both understood. The future was theirs to create. No titles, no expectations, just two people ready to write their own story. In a world full of expectations, power plays, and the constant pursuit of status, the story of Ethan and Delaney teaches us a powerful lesson about what truly matters. Both of them, coming from different worlds, found something they'd been searching for all along: authenticity. Ethan, a mechanic, never tried to be anyone he wasn't. He did his job with honesty, without the desire for recognition or wealth. And Delaney, a billionaire CEO, realized that in the pursuit of her empire, she had lost sight of the things that made her truly happy. The simple, real connections with people who saw her for who she truly was, not her title. Their story reminds us that success doesn't always look the way society expects it to. It's not about wealth, power, or appearances. It's about genuine relationships, personal fulfillment, and staying true to yourself. Sometimes we need to stop chasing things that don't matter and focus on what makes us feel alive. In a world that constantly tells us to be something we're not, Ethan and Delaney's journey shows us that embracing who we truly are is the key to finding happiness and peace.